It was a cold, windy night in the small town of Kanazawa. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional street lamp flickering in the breeze. Koichi had just finished working late at the library and was heading home, walking the path that led him through a deserted part of town, past the old train station. The station hadn't been in use for years, and the rumors about it were enough to keep most people away. But Koichi wasn't one to believe in urban legends. As he walked, the wind picked up, rustling the trees along the sidewalk. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, his footsteps echoing on the empty street. He thought back to a conversation he'd overheard earlier in the day. Some students had been talking about the ghost stories surrounding the station. They mentioned something about a spirit, a woman who lost her legs and roams the area, seeking revenge on anyone who crosses her path. Koichi shook his head.
Ridiculous.
As he walked, the wind picked up, rustling the trees along the sidewalk. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, his footsteps echoing on the empty street. He thought back to a conversation he'd overheard earlier in the day. Some students had been talking about the ghost stories surrounding the station. They mentioned something about a spirit, a woman who lost her legs and roams the area, seeking revenge on anyone who crosses her path. Suddenly, he heard a faint noise, a scraping sound.
Teke, teke, teke.
As he walked, the wind picked up, rustling the trees along the sidewalk. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, his footsteps echoing on the empty street. He thought back to a conversation he'd overheard earlier in the day. Some students had been talking about the ghost stories surrounding the station. They mentioned something about a spirit, a woman who lost her legs and roams the area, seeking revenge on anyone who crosses her path. At first, he saw nothing but the empty road stretching back toward the town. But then, out of the shadows, something began to move. It was low to the ground, barely visible at first. As it got closer, Koichi's breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, or rather, half of one. Her upper body dragged itself along the pavement, her elbows scraping against the ground. Her long, dark hair fell over her face, hiding her expression. But Koichi could feel the rage, the pain emanating from her. The sound of her movement.
Teke, teke, teke.
Sent a chill through his bones. Without thinking, Koichi turned and ran. His legs pumped as fast as they could, the sound of his own footsteps mixing with the relentless teke, teke behind him. He glanced back over his shoulder and felt his blood freeze. She was fast. Faster than he ever imagined something without legs could be. Her torso skidded along the ground with unnatural speed, and she was gaining on him. Panic set in as Koichi sprinted toward the station's crossing. If he could just make it past the tracks, maybe he'd be safe. Maybe the stories were wrong. He could still outrun her. He had to. But as he reached the crossing, the scraping sound stopped. Silence fell over the street, save for the sound of his ragged breathing. He dared to slow down, glancing around in confusion. The air was still. No sign of the creature. Koichi's pulse began to settle, and he let out a shaky laugh. "It's just my imagination," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "There's no such thing." A cold hand gripped his ankle. Koichi screamed, stumbling forward, but the grip tightened, pulling him down. He crashed onto the tracks, face pressed against the cold metal as he tried to kick free. Turning his head, he saw her, closer now, inches from his face. Her eyes gleamed with a malicious light as she dragged herself up his leg.
Do you need your legs?
She whispered, her voice cold and sharp like the wind slicing through the night. Koichi's mind raced, trying to find words, any words, that might save him. But nothing came. He was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror coursing through him. Her hand tightened on his ankle, her face contorting into a twisted smile. Before he could even think to scream, she raised a jagged piece of metal in her other hand and slashed. Pain seared through his body, white-hot and blinding. He tried to crawl away, but it was too late. His vision blurred as he felt the cold sensation of the tracks beneath his waist. He tried to move his legs, but they weren't there. Through the haze of pain, Koichi heard it again, the sound that would haunt his final moments.
Teek, teek, teek.
As the world faded to black, the last thing he saw was her dragging herself back into the darkness, his legs in tow.